Well, welcome back to another Timeout Tuesday podcast. My name is Josh Pardee, senior pastor here at Hopevale, and I have Pastor Sam Burke here with me. How are we doing today, Sam?
I'm doing great. How are you, Josh?
Doing great. And we are going to kind of wrap up our Jonah series.
Yeah, this has been fun.
Yeah, it's been a nice... The fun thing with Jonah is you get a whole story, and you get 1 week per chapter is how we split it up.
Right.
And so... you tell this story over the course of a month, and that's a way to kind of elongate it a little bit, but also it's not a super long story either, right? So it's like a nice, compact, succinct story that's been fun. So, I'm going to hand over the keys to you to play host again this week, because I preached this past week. So I'll hand it over to you, and you get to start firing the questions.
Yeah, let's do like a softball, easy, not really into Jonah kind of a question. Sure. So this chapter focuses on a plant in the story of Jonah, right? So I started thinking this, you're preaching, and I'm like, I wonder if he's ever tried his hand at planting anything.
Ooh, yes.
So have you ever planted anything and it was successful?
Yes. Great question. And this is actually reminding me, so for those who are our loyal listeners who listened along last week,
right?
You asked me a question, who's my favorite band?
Yeah.
And I just completely blanked. I was like, I don't know. As soon as we got done recording, I was like, oh shoot, I should have, a bunch of names come to mind. But I would say the favorite that I've had over the past couple years is Ben Rector. So I just want to get that on the record. He's like great music that my whole family likes. It's just kind of like, light dinner music or get home from work, something kind of just
throw something on.
Yeah. Everyone will listen to it and likes it. My kids all go around singing it. And Brandy and I have some kind of inside language jokes of different songs and all that sort of stuff. So I felt bad that I just completely blanked last time.
You made up for it. So that's great.
Yeah. And then as far as growing things, I would say, so when Brandy and I lived in the Chicagoland area, we worked at a church there, and we lived in the parsonage, and the people before us actually grew a garden. So it was all set up for us. And I don't know that that's something we would have just done on our own, but since it was there, I was like, well, should we just try this? Yeah. And so we did. We had all sorts of different vegetables and peppers and tomatoes and zucchini. And
this was not a setup question. I didn't even know that.
That's literally what happened. And then we got to know our neighbors really well, and they would just use the garden as well. And if we were out of town, they would water it for us. And then it was funny, we moved away, and no one moved into the house for a while. And then our neighbors kept running the garden for a while because they liked it. So that is my experience with gardening.
That's really cool. That's really cool. That's awesome. I have not had a lot of experience gardening. The only time I've ever been successful was when I was 7 years old. Okay. And I grabbed a handful of beans out of my mom's pantry or whatever. And I was being goofy and just threw them in. We had a planter outside of our window in our front yard. And I forgot all about it. I didn't even remember it. I didn't water it on purpose, nothing. We had a sprinkler that would go on a timer. Okay. So one day I'm out there and I noticed all of it was all the dirt was cracked. Yeah. In a really weird way and dried out. This is California, so whatever. Sure. So I picked it up and there was this spider web of bean plant growing underneath. I was like, Mom! And then we sure enough, all those beans had all grown.
It's the mystery of the Lord, right? Some plant, and you can water it, but it's the Lord who brings it to fruition.
I wasn't trying to do anything. I was just screwing around, and it didn't happen. So that's awesome. My plant story. Okay, so we dove into chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the defining chapter of Jonah, right? So it's the we find out what's really going on in Jonah's head and his heart. Yeah. And you started off with this bet wager thing you did yesterday. I don't want to talk about that, but it got me thinking about this idea, because you landed the wager with, well, what if you were to take $1 million, but your enemy got $100 million? And I was like, ooh, there's something there, because the room felt really everybody kind of got I don't know. So my question was this: why are we so intrigued as people? Why do you think we're so intrigued or comfortable with retribution for our enemies, but not compassion and forgiveness for them? as a human being, like, what is that thing? As a pastor, what I've seen it, you've probably seen it a lot. Like, people are really quick to want to get back, but not always easily to forgive.
Yeah.
And all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So what do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's several different things that contribute to it. I mean, I think if I think of my own life, and I think part of what we see from the story of Jonah is that we feel like we're the ones qualified to judge all and see all. And we think that the way that we see the world is complete and we're seeing the whole picture.
Right.
And part of what happens with Jonah and God is God saying, hey, I have actually a different, broader perspective here of this work that I'm trying to do in the world.
Right.
And they're actually responding to good news, and you don't want to be a part of it. And so, yeah, I think part of it is we just, because there are moments we don't, I don't think we always want vengeance or retribution for people. There's some people that we want mercy and compassion for. Usually if we relate to them, if we can identify ourselves in them. This was what's been so powerful in our movies and how we tell stories,
right?
Especially in superheroes. And we've had, like, over the past, whatever it's been, 20 years, maybe 15 years, like the anti-hero story.
Right.
And part of that story is designed to people that we see as bad guys originally. We see that, like, you get brought into their character development, right? And then you're like, oh, there's actually more happening here. And I don't agree with what this person did, but I can understand. And then vice versa, the cleanly polished superhero, you get brought into some of their demons or their struggles or whatever, so, like, I think that's part of it is a lot of times when we're wanting vengeance for people, retribution, we are thinking that we have the whole picture on it, and we don't. And when we see the human side of people, I think in its best form, like, I think that there should be consequences for decisions, right?
Yep.
But if I really care about the person, if I don't care about the person, I'm fine with retribution and violence and vengeance.
For sure.
But if I care about the person, I would say, man, I don't agree with their actions. I think there's some work here that they need to do, but I would ultimately want it to be about restoration instead of retribution, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of the perspective we're being given. And I think when we start, and this is why the Bible is so helpful to us, because it's giving us God's perspective and broadening our view on things. And we're being invited into seeing the world of, not that there just anything goes, or that there aren't consequences for decisions or any of those things, but what does it look like for restoration ultimately to come out of this? And what's the path forward? And how do we love people along in that journey?
Exactly. Yeah. Do you think that part of it is, like, we so easily dehumanize people? And so it's easy to think, like, I think of, like, when, people do something really atrocious and we're not connected in, or we're not, like, we don't know them, or don't have any FaceTime with them.
We're just detached from the whole thing.
It's just staying detached. We can dehumanize them and just kind of then vilify them and then judge them from afar.
Yeah.
Versus when you have to be face to face with someone, how the humanity of it sinks back in, and you go, oh, you're not much different than me, kind of a.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we want to be really bold here, we would say, the work of dehumanizing is the work of the Satan.
Yeah.
Right. Is Satan's work of getting us to believe that people are less than image bearers, less than they're called to. And that doesn't mean that people are, again, living into the things that they're supposed to, right? But to live into that lie is to participate in his work,
right?
And to start seeing people as less than God created them to be.
Right. And we don't know this from the text, but I wonder if it was easy for Jonah just to kind of vilify them from afar.
Oh, yeah.
And then he has to go into the town, and it's like, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
what if his heart starts changing, you know?
Well, that seems to be the thing Jonah won't let happen.
Right, yeah.
He's not going to let his heart, he's not going to give in. You know,
Yeah.
I think of even, you know, my kids and when they're young, right? Like you're offering something and you can even like kind of laugh with them. Like they're really mad about something. You can kind of laugh and you can tell they're just like, they're trying not to laugh.
I'm not going to laugh.
I will not be a part. I will not let you win this over. And I think that's part of what we're seeing from Jonah in that.
Exactly. Yeah. So you went to Exodus 34, 6. Can you explain to us again why that is such an important thing for the context of Jonah 4?
Yeah.
And then what does this mean in our context here, like removed thousands of years later, when it comes to grace and truth?
Yeah. Yeah. So I hopped into Jonah is quoting right at the very beginning of chapter 4 this idea of who God is. He says, God, listen, I knew you were compassionate. I knew you were gracious. I knew you were slow to anger. I knew this is who you were. But then and this is a famous Bible passage, Exodus 34:6, that was repeated, from my understanding, very regularly throughout the community of who Yahweh was. But Jonah intentionally, I believe, leaves off the word faithfulness.
Right.
It's the Hebrew word echmeth.
Yep.
And I try my best Hebrew impersonation.
It's actually the root of his dad's name, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's where Amittai comes from.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's exactly it. So he's the son of Echmech.
Yeah.
Right. And so, he's making this accusation, and that word faithfulness in Exodus 34:6 it's the same word for truth, right? As you said, with his name. And so I think he's making this charge. God, you're not a God of truth. Right. You are giving grace and compassion and mercy. That's fine. But you are not a God of truth, because you would not let these people off the hook if you were doing that. And so that's really important in understanding when you get to the end of Jonah, because I think some people have thought I've been a little critical of Jonah throughout this series, or you're like, or they're asking questions like, well, how do you know that Jonah, you know, was preaching his sermon, giving the bare minimum, and not with the heart, and hasn't, you know, you preached on chapter 2, and like, how do you know that it wasn't true transformation that's happened in his life, a prayer of repentance? Well, we get our answer by reading the end of the book, right? Like, you know, I don't know if you had any friends. I had friends in college, and they would, you know, for an assignment, they would basically just read the last chapter, and then they would go back and just kind of look at the headings, and then they would just take that as like, now they understood at least where the author was going, right?
Oh, 100%. And when me and my friends, we used to watch the show Lost.
Okay.
But they were a way further ahead than I was.
Okay.
And I would be talking about an episode, and they were like, I don't know, just wait till you see where this is going. And I'm like, that's so unfair. You already know the end of the story. So that's 100% that thing.
But that's why sometimes when we read the Bible or just books in general, right? But it's actually helpful to read the end last, because you're like, oh, so this is where the story ends.
Right.
So what is being built up through, right?
Yep.
And so what's being built up through is that Jonah is, sure, he repented, and sure, he went and preached a sermon, but immediately after that, which chapter 4 picks up, immediately afterwards, he's moving out to the city, away from God's presence, throwing himself a pity party, hoping that there's going to be destruction and fire that fall on this city. And so then I think that's really important to understand for who Jonah is, how the book works, where the book is leading itself to. And then the second part of your question of how does this play into grace and truth, right? How do we think about this for ourselves? And I think, I mean, there's a couple things, and I maybe I'll kick it back to you in a second, just of why you're asking that question, if you have thoughts about that. But I think it's this understanding that sometimes people will say that they are all about truth. Truth is the easy thing to rally people around, because we want to be people of truth who understand the truth, who are living into truth. But the way that people will hold that is not actually that they are for you.
Right.
It's actually that they are for their understanding of what truth is.
Right.
And
Exactly. Yeah.
they kind of almost want to beat you over the head with it.
Yeah.
Right. At least
conform you to their thing. Yeah.
Yes. And that's been my experience. And I think that's kind of what Jonah wanted to preach and attempted to maybe even preach in chapter 3 is he's just hoping that they will not ultimately respond. Or if he could preach a sermon, he would preach them to converting to his understanding of the world. And God is trying to blow that up and say, I have a completely broader perspective here of what this looks like. And Jonah is willing, the son of Amittai is willing to give the truth, but he's not willing to give the grace. And so when we get to Jesus, we see that Jesus is the embodiment of both grace and truth.
Exactly why I asked the question. Because we just gone through this series and you talked about, calibrating grace and truth.
Yeah.
Right. And so Jonah points out, God, you are calibrated all grace here.
Yep.
No truth.
Right.
Jonah is coming at it from I'm all truth and I don't want to give grace. But I think what we see here is Jonah's like, I'm all my version of truth.
Yep.
And what we're finding from God is God's going, I have a more objective truth that I'm looking at this lens from. And so as you were talking about that yesterday, I was like, that's all I could think of was this calibration of grace and truth and how easy it is for us to slip into this. Well, I got to be truth here.
Sure.
Because there's all I'm seeing is all grace and nobody's speaking any truth. But what we are in essence doing is saying, I have to be my version of truth.
Right.
Not really saying, okay, is this God's objective version of truth?
Yeah. And so if you go back into the sermon about grace and truth back in our Life with Jesus series, right? Like the goal is not to pick one or the other. The goal is to calibrate, and actually love requires meeting the person where they are at and helping them take the next step. Right. And so I'm leading this discipleship cohort right now, and we were going over the grace and truth paradigm. And what was happening in the group is, these questions of, well, what if we do like the good cop, bad cop? Like, is that grace and truth? And it kind of that's what you're getting at, though, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, you're bringing all truth, so I'll bring some grace. You're bringing all grace, so I'll bring some truth. And the answer is that's not what we're trying to do.
Right. Yeah.
We're trying to live into the way of love, and love is calibrating both of those things. And so, really, the idea of good cop, bad cop in a grace and truth paradigm doesn't work,
right?
Because it's fundamentally misunderstanding how to apply and live into these realities. And
it's the accusation from Jonah going, God, grace is fine, whatever for me, not for them, because you're absent of truth,
right?
But it's not really. God's saying, no, I have the full picture of truth.
Yeah, grace was fine for me when I tried to run to the end of the known world. Grace is fine for me when a fish rescued me. Grace is fine for me when a plant grew up over my head. I'm all about receiving that grace. Right? So
it's not that he's objected to grace, but he's only likes it when it comes his way, not to his enemy's way. And so, I just think that's what was going through my head when you were talking about Exodus 34. I was like, this grace and truth thing is a really big deal. And there's a reason why John says that Jesus came full of grace and truth. And it really exemplified that for us. But God, the Father, is full of grace and truth also. And Jonah's pointing out to him in an accusatory way, you don't have any truth here. Right. Because if you did, you would handle those people. Right. And God's saying, yeah, my truth is bigger than your version of my truth. Kind of a deal.
Yeah.
Okay, so talk about this statement about blessings that you talked about yesterday. You said blessings are not given on the basis of who is deserving, but rather on the basis of God's grace. And so why is that so important to the story of Jonah? And how do we live our lives and interact with God on the basis of that, on the basis of God, his grace is what blesses us, not how we earn it.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to do, and we'll just kind of like double click on it, is I think a lot of times we associate God's blessings or God's grace as a direct correlation, a 1-for-1 with our actions and what we're doing. So if I'm doing all of the right things, then God will bless me and give me favor. If I am not, then I will experience discipline or punishment or sort of things. And to go a little bit deeper than I did in the sermon yesterday, that's actually a very pagan way of understanding how the world works and is set up. This is how ancient cultures thought that deity worked, that you were there to appease the gods. Right. And if you minded your own business, and as long as you didn't tick them off, and as long as you kind of were in somewhat quasi good favor with them, then they would maybe send rain so that you would have a good harvest, or they would bless your business, or whatever it would be. And if you were experiencing pain and hardship, then that meant that you were not living in the will of God, or your God was mad at you, or those sorts of things. But what we find from this God Yahweh, who's revealed to us through Jesus, is this isn't the case. That grace is this unmerited, undeserved gift that everyone is given. That actually, when you understand the biblical story, none of us deserve any of this. We're all given these amazing blessings. And so it's not, when I receive good things in my life, I think it's dangerous for us, even probably we could say, to start thinking, well, this is because I deserve this, or that builds up self-righteousness. It creates a pompous sort of attitude in us. And it's not good for transforming us. But if I come to this conversation of thinking, you know what, all of the things that I have in my life are based off of God's goodness and his blessing and his grace. And we learn about this ultimately about who God is, that this Yahweh that's dealing with Jonah in his book. But ultimately, this comes and is culminated in the life of Jesus, who, Hebrews will tell us is the exact representation of who God is. He is, John will say, as we already said, the fullness of grace and truth, right? Like, he is the one who has come, the word has become flesh. This is who God, if you want to know what God looks like, you look to Jesus.
Right, absolutely.
And what Jesus shows us is that grace is not based off of anything we deserve or we earn. Paul will say, for by grace alone you are saved, right? There's nothing you can do to earn grace. It is just a gift. And so I think that we do get a little bit of a warped perception. We lean into so maybe the way I just say it again is pagan understandings of how we think the world might be constructed, and that's not how God has constructed the world. I think,
and that's important for us because especially this side of the cross, in how we interact with people and our neighbors and all that kind of stuff, and how we interact with God. It's like, it's not God's got some kind of like a checklist going, like, hey, you didn't do this today, so you're going to get this today, kind of a deal. And so we shouldn't have that approach with our neighbors either, right?
Yeah.
I had
or our family, or, I mean, the impulse within me is to not only to relate to God that way, but to relate to everyone in my life that way. Family, coworkers, 100%. Employees, employers, fellow business partners, is to, well, you did this, you scratched my back, so now I'll scratch yours. You were mean to me, so now I'm going to be mean to you.
And that's why it's so hard when people have all these questions about forgiveness, right? So I had someone come up to me yesterday and we're like, question, if someone did something to me, I'm having a real hard time forgiving them. What does that look like? What does that mean? And so I walked them through that, but they're having a real hard time understanding forgiveness, understanding boundaries, all that kind of stuff. But it's like in their mind, it was like either I forgive them and let them walk all over me, or I don't forgive them. It's like this black or white kind of thinking. And I think it's...
Or one of the teachings, sorry, I mean, cut you off, but one of the teachings that we sometimes run with that I don't think is helpful either is that forgiveness means forgetting. And that goes right along with, now I can't set up boundaries because I just have to forgive. And that's not what we're saying.
No,
actually,
not at all.
You very much need those things. And the way that Jesus will even teach about forgiveness would be to include those things. I mean, we don't want to go too far down that path today, but
the point is that this idea of forgiveness sometimes is really difficult for people because you have this pagan understanding sometimes of, well, if I forgive you, that means I just have to let everything go, or I can't forgive you, and so I'm just going to give you what you deserve, an eye for an eye, tooth for this Old Testament law-based, and grace kind of walks all over that and says, no, this is something better, you know. So that I love that. So Jonah gets mad about this plant. He gets really happy. He gets really. It's the first, you pointed out. It's the only time in the whole story he's happy. Like the only time, except for maybe when he's in the belly of the fish, saying, "Okay, I guess I'll go do what you say. Whatever. Thank you for."
It's more like he relented.
Exactly. So he gets happy about this plant, which I think is really fascinating. Then this worm comes and destroys it. Then this east wind comes. Whatever. All this stuff. So. Here's my question. The irony of that he gets happy about that and then he gets mad about it. Why is it so important that God pushes back on Jonah here?
Well, because I think it goes back to something we already touched on of he's trying to give Jonah's holding and clutching his pearls about what truth is.
Right.
And God is trying to show him that there's a bigger picture here of what truth is.
Right.
And in fact, Jonah has a very distorted understanding of, again, blessings, of what he deserves.
Yep.
So he's just getting completely backwards in thinking that he's entitled to deserving certain things, and the Ninevites are not entitled to certain things. So much so, and it's almost an absurdity. I think it's one of those things I said in the first week of the series, that there's quite a bit of satire components to this story. And I think one of the things that's, just being illustrated is that you have this plant that grows up overnight that Jonah apparently has this deep affection for and is happy about. And meanwhile, 120,000 people and their animals are all repenting.
Right.
And he can't even be on board with that. He can't even have a vision for that. And so it's like this comparing and contrasting these two just absurd things. Like and again, my life is the parent of young children. So I just think of so much of life this way right now. But, I will live this out with my kids. We will have the best day. We will go and just have an amazing day where they get to do, we get to go have fun, and we go and do all the things that they want to do, and we go out to eat at the place they want to go out to eat, and I buy them dessert. I'm like this amazing dad. And then we get home, and it's, they can't now sit on the TV or their Kindle or whatever it is, or what, they can't have an extra dessert, and it's just like complete meltdown. And you're just like, are you serious? Like, do you not see all the things I just did, that we just spent the day, we spent our money, we tried to give you this amazing day, and this is how we're going to end?
Exactly.
And it's painting this absurd picture. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing happen here with God and Jonah, is just this absurdity. Like, really? So you're really going to be mad about the plant?
There's 120,000 people who just repented and turned to me, and now you're mad over the little
You're
plant.
the greatest evangelist in 5 Hebrew words, and you're complaining to me about a plant.
Yeah, well, it's because he didn't get what he wanted, right? What he wanted was shade. He wanted the plant. He did not want the people.
He wanted to throw shade.
Just nice. It's just priority, right? So, okay, so you asked us to reflect on our own lives in light of the story of Jonah, right? And to kind of use it as a mirror for us. And I think you said this: how many verses of our life would be dedicated to God pursuing us and trying to get our attention? So my question was this: why is this such an important perspective to have after interacting with the story of Jonah?
Yeah, well, because we're all Jonah, I think it's easy then to read Jonah and go, oh, well, he just didn't get it. But now I do.
I get it.
Now,
exactly.
Or even sitting, like having this little bit of snobbery about when in the story we're born. So we're born on the other side of Jesus, and we're born on the other side of this understanding of grace and how it works, where God is continuing to reveal himself, building up to who Jesus is. And so it's easy to sit on this side of the cross and be like, well, now, again, to just look down almost on Jonah, which is really what Jonah is doing throughout the story. And so I think that's where the importance lies, is us just considering, like, if God were to write 4 chapters on my life, 48 verses, how many times is he trying to get my attention? How many times is he trying to invite me into his perspective? How many times am I looking down at other people? How many times am I thinking I've got it right and they've got it wrong?
Right.
And God is trying to let me see things from his vantage point. And at least for me, I mean, the reason I posed the question is because as I was considering and thinking about that, I'm like, that gives me a different posture of entering in and sitting with and digesting the story that we've walked through for 4 weeks of like, I really am Jonah so many more times than I wish I was. I wish I wish I didn't always live that way. And that's not like a shame-filled thing. That's not to burden us down, but it is also to just not live into this idea of, well, now we have it all figured out. But I think Jonah at the end of the day is like a cautionary tale, right? Of how our life can be and how we can orient ourselves in this world to be opposed to the things that God is actively trying to work on.
Right. Absolutely. So you said this bottom line thing that Jonah's issue wasn't that, God loved the Ninevite people is that he wanted Jonah to love the Ninevite people, right?
Right.
So why is that such an important issue for us to confront in our own lives today? And as you think about Hopevale, as you think about the neighbor challenge that we just did, like, why is this such an important thing to confront even before trying to do the neighbor thing?
I think it's important because we all have that thing in us that wants to elevate ourselves, that wants to elevate our community, that wants to think higher of ourselves. I also think, like, this is just an important moment for us to consider this based off of where we're at as a society.
Right.
We're in an election year, would be a real practical application to this. And we live in a world, and I say this regularly, and I'll keep saying it because I really think it's important for us to hear. We live in a world that breathes fear, and that tries to other people and tries to paint. I think we could say participates in the work that we said earlier of like dehumanizing and the work of Satan and seeing people as less than image bearers.
Right.
And I think anytime that's happening, what can happen is we can even kind of be sentimental about, well, yeah, God loves everyone, but it's not really my job to love everyone.
Am I supposed to love everyone too? Yeah.
And the thing that we find throughout Scripture is, for sure, what we find in Jonah's story is that's what God's inviting him into, is for him to love his enemy. And we're going to get into this coming up in a series coming up in April. But God really, anytime we're seeing God work through the Bible, it's almost exclusively through his image bearers.
Right.
It's not actually God just working alone. There are a few moments where God is working alone by himself. But the way that he has hardwired creation is that you and I, as we said back in the Your Kingdom Come series, are his image bearers, called to have a role and responsibility, called to be little images of God who walk around and are caretakers for this world. And so there is this sense of the way that God's love is extended and his kingdom is brought and that we get to participate in is by following the way of Jesus and loving our enemies, and not just saying, God, you go love them, but actually, what is my role to love people that either are my enemies? And the reason I bring up the election stuff is because we're going to be told that this whole group of people, no matter where you sit, is your enemy.
Your enemy, and they're wrong, you're right. Yeah,
exactly. And so, I mean, again, if there's ever a time for the church to rise up and offer a counter story, this is the moment that we have some good news for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you were preaching yesterday and landing it, my mind, for whatever reason, ran to the Psalms, and it ran to Psalm 46. So a lot of us know the end of Psalm 46, right? It says, be still and know that I'm God. But not a lot of us read it in the context that it was written in, right? And so I think I was reading this a while back, but the context that Psalm 46:10 is written in is the writer is looking at his enemies and like, God, I need you to do stuff. And this is what it says: Lord Almighty is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and see what the Lord has done. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields, or the NIV says shields. I think it's the chariots, I think is what the real word is. With fire, he says, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. Not meaning, hey, time to have quiet time. But meaning, hey, there's a lot of clamoring going on that you're trying to like fight and go after all this. And he's like, just be still.
Right.
It's like, when my kids are like, Dad's here, just be still.
Right.
I'll take care of it.
Right.
And what he does is he says, I'm going to take care of it by war ceasing.
Yeah.
And so God's version of Jonah in this with Jonah is, Jonah, be still.
Right.
Be still. Know that I'm God. I'm taking care of it in the way I want to take care of it.
Right.
And I did take care of it in spite of you. I wish you would have been on board.
Absolutely.
Kind of a deal.
Yeah.
So that was all I started thinking of that when you were kind of walking through, and I thought, what would it look like for us as the church to just be still and know that he is God? And when he invites us into something, just go, all right, I'm going to go with you and be invited into that,
Yeah, that's so good. I love that, Sam. Because that word he uses there for be still, it means to be surrendered or to be weak and to just recognize that like he's in that posture. And the rest of what the stories we're invited into in this world are, don't surrender, don't be weak, pick up your weapons, pick up your torches, pick up your megaphones, pick up whatever, the device is at the moment. And so there's this huge component of faith that Yahweh is who he says he is, and that he'll bring to fruition good out of people's life. And so that's where we as a faith community get to step in and live into what we believe to be true there. That's powerful.
Absolutely.
That's awesome.
Cool.
Well, thanks so much for asking questions, and it's been a fun series, and fun to have you here, and it's been great to have all of you joining us here on the podcast as well. Hope you have a great week. Hope to see you all on Sunday.